Welcome to The Jewish Lens, a podcast to discuss anything and everything from a Jewish perspective. Now, please help me welcome the man who controls the media, your host, Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen, and today I am thrilled to welcome an award-winning documentary filmmaker, academic, podcaster, and author. His work has been featured in such places as the BBC, ABC, PBS, among many other places. Among his books include Israel, the Diaspora and Jewish Identity, and the upcoming The Watchmaker's War, a compelling historical novel of revenge and justice based on the true story of Nazi hunters in Australia. He's the founder of the award-winning documentary company Identity Films and Productions. Among his films include Shloshim Israel, The First 30 Days After October 7th, Survive to Tell, which is a VR film documenting the experience of the October 7th survivors, Shalom Bollywood, about the Jewish community in India, and many others. Please help me welcome Danny Ben Moshe. Danny, thanks so much for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, we have a lot to cover, but I want to start by saying that, like I told you before we started recording, that I'm a fan. It's been some time, but I've seen Shalom Bollywood and Outback Rabbis and thoroughly enjoyed them. So I always like to start by going back with people I'm talking to. So let me start by going back even further. Where did you grow up, and what was your family life like, in particular with regards to Judaism?
I'm a Londoner. I live in Melbourne. I have lived in Israel. I'm fairly nomadic, but I grew up in a kind of middle-class Jewish home in North London, in an area called Hampstead Garden Suburb, for anyone who's familiar with old London town. And interestingly, it turns out, as kids, you think the world you grow up in is just normative. That's the world everyone grows up in. And there were three things that I discovered as a later adult that led to three films I made about my family. So that's a hat trick, as they say in football, proper football, not American football, English soccer. One was a documentary called My Mother's Lost Children.
I'm going to ask you about that as well, yeah.
I always knew I had these long lost half siblings that I grew up with. It was just, and that they were taken and they were in Iran from my mother's first marriage. And that ended up being a film I made called My Mother's Lost Children, and the podcast My Lost Family. I grew up in my summer holidays hanging out in wine bars in the back of fashion shops in the West End of London. And when my father owned the famous ladies' boutique called Lady Jane in Carnaby Street in the swinging 60s London. And that gave me access to all these kind of people who were at the heart of swinging 60s London. There is a documentary I made called Carnaby Street Undressed. And then the third film I made was, the mantra, make what you know. I was making a film it was actually my first documentary. I had a career before. I didn't become a filmmaker till I was in my 30s. I was making a documentary about a group of Holocaust survivors called the Buchenwald Ball, for one of Australia's public broadcasters, SBS. And I was sitting interviewing one of the children of survivors, and he said, growing up, we just thought it was normal that you didn't have extended family, right? And I was like 33 or 35 or something, and I was like, hold on a minute. I never had any extended family. And that turned into a documentary about my family's experience in Lithuania in the Second World War, called Rewriting History, and my grandmother being the sole survivor. So I kind of, I wouldn't say I grew up in the most orthodox, I don't mean in religious sense, I mean in conventional sense, family, but it became fertile territory to encourage my creativity and ultimately the specific stories I told.
It's funny, you mentioned that that your family had something on Carnaby Street, a famous clothing shop. You're the second person I've interviewed now that had a famous clothing place in London. I interviewed the family that owned from Rigby and Peller. So as well. So what made you move to Australia? What prompted that? What made you or your family decide to move there?
The Great Migration Factor. I met an Australian woman.
There we go. Okay.
I actually met an Australian woman in Israel, and where I moved to, and moved down here just for a short period of time. Well, it was to do a PhD, and I'm a perfect example of the John Lennon words: "Life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans." Came down here was said 5 years. I never intended to live in Australia. Here I am 30 years later telling you that tale.
So you were never interested in filmmaking as a kid?
No, that's not true. I was always interested. My interests were really kind of politics and history is what I was interested in. Like I used to, like as a 14, 15, 16-year-old, I used to kind of, I read like Auschwitz and the Allies by, these non-fiction books. I would sit at home and I would sneak a cigarette or a joint out the window of my bedroom and then watch a documentary film about some historical or political circumstance. And my dad was a big consumer of documentaries and current affairs. And I got into, as a graduate, I studied law, which I hated and I never wanted to do. And that was very much under sort of family pressure, become a lawyer kind of thing. Studied it, hated it, never practiced it. But interested, and then I kind of went into public policy work. But interestingly, when I was moving house about 20 years ago, I was emptying a cupboard, as you kind of do, and lifted up a box and it collapsed underneath and all these papers fell out. And it was a letter I wrote to the Israel Broadcasting Authority, Channel 1, which was the only channel in Israel at the time. We're talking like the late 1980s, saying, I've got an idea for a documentary. Can I please make it for them? Which is just so embarrassing that I did that. But to their credit, some mensch received my letter and who wrote back a nice letter in the days before emails to explain why they couldn't make my documentary, or they wouldn't get me to make my documentary. So I'd always been a consumer of documentaries. Even in my 20s when I was working, I would always go to film festivals and watch documentaries, and it was my viewing habit. And in fact, when young filmmakers come to me now and say, shall I do a master's degree? Shall I do a this, that? I say to them, two things. One, get connected to people in the industry, and two, watch as many documentaries as you can. And I think, like, if someone was to ask me what I want to become a filmmaker, what's the best pathway? And there is no single pathway. And I'm not the documentary god, so I can't bestow on anyone the secret to it. But I would much rather say, kind of, immerse yourself in the subject area that you may think are the stories you want to tell, rather than studying a 3-year degree on filmmaking where you spend all this time on lights and sound. I mean, I'm technically useless. I didn't study any of that. You work with crews. If you don't have a story, and if you don't have a way to access that story, then all the technical skills in the world are not going to be that helpful. I was working in public policy for a number of years, and then I became an academic, and I was working I was directing a research institute at a university here in Melbourne, and we wanted to disseminate some of our research by films rather than just traditional publications. Okay. It was this kind of whole strategy approach. And it just so happened that a professor in my institute said, my brother's a filmmaker, a guy by the name of Andrew Wiseman, not Jewish. go and speak to him. Maybe he can make these films for us. So I went to see him, and I'm now guilty. I was guilty of what now happens to me, what I experience regularly as a sort of established filmmaker. I said, we want to make a short film about this bit of research and that bit of research. And he goes, yeah, well, you could do this, you could do that, 3-minute film, 5-minute film. And I go, and I've got an idea for a documentary. So those ideas I had when I was a student for the Israel Broadcasting Authority had not gone away. And he said to me, what is it? And he goes, that's a great idea. And he basically held my hand very kindly. And that was my first documentary, The Book on the Wall, in 2025. And, filmmaking can be like a drug. I was just hooked. I just had to make my next film. And but you're only as good as your last film. It doesn't seem to get any easier. You're only as good as your next film. Sorry, last film doesn't count for much.
Well, so let me jump. Speaking of your films, let me jump around to some of your films because I want to start at the lighter and before we hit some of the heavier ones. And I want to start with one I saw, and I mentioned it to you. And I was a fan even before I knew that it was you. So Shalom Bollywood, a fascinating documentary. And it seems like, much like Hollywood, Jews had a hand in helping out the film industry in India. So can you give me a little bit of that history? And how did this come to your attention?
People ask me, how do you go out and find your films? And I have to tell them, I don't go out and find them, they find me.
Sure.
And I knew nothing about India. I never watched a Bollywood film. I tried, couldn't stand them, right? Not my genre. I'm just being honest. It was in my... after I made my first film in 2005, The Buchel Ball, I made a couple of other films sort of on the side while still being an academic, still running this research institute. And I had a postgraduate student, international student from India, who got into some difficulties with her landlord. I think the landlord was just being exploitative of an international student with the university in terms of her thesis. And I helped her out. I called the landlord and said, that's just not a way to treat people. And I helped her with the university process. It was no big deal, right? It was just kind of my job. And she was very grateful. And then I discovered that Indians seem to have this habit, or her family at least had this habit, of sending what we would call schmutzkes, right? Little chick-chucks, gifts of appreciation. And there'd be a knock on my office door. And she would come in, this is a pen from my father, right? This is a key ring from my father, from my family. We're so grateful, we're so thank you. And I said, really, I don't need anything. It's fine. So another day, there's a knock on the family not living in Australia. She was there alone. Knock on the door. And she goes, this is an article my father sent for you. He thought it'd be of interest because it's about a Jewish actress in Bollywood. And I was ready when she held out the piece of paper to kind of say politely, thank you very much, take it and put it straight into my recycling pile. And it was like, Jewish actress in Bollywood? Wow, that's amazing. And it was about Nadira, who just passed away. This would have been 2006. So I just made my first film, The Buchel Ball. I knew I wanted to make another film, didn't know what, and then this came to me. So cutting a long story short, I took myself off to India to make what I thought would do the research to make a film about Nadira, this Jewish superstar actress in Bollywood. And then when I would tell people, I did what you do as a filmmaker, and I kind of just followed what I had been doing as an academic researcher, going to the location, plonking yourself in the community, talking to as many people as possible, like gathering your data. So I was staying in Baikala in accommodation, not too salubrious, in the Magen David, behind the Magen David synagogue in Mumbai. And I would say to people, I'd start going to communal events and talking to the people in the community. And I would go, blah, 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 making a film about Nadira. Do you know anyone who knew her? Yes, yes, yes. and you should speak to Pramila's son. And I'm like, I go, who's Pramila? Pramila, the first Miss India, and she was Jewish. And I go, what? And
Wow.
you should speak to Nando. Who's Nando? Nando, the son of the famous blah 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 actress. And then so and so. Oh, I can take you to see the grave of my uncle. Who's your uncle? Uncle David, the famous actor. So everywhere I turned. So the story, with filmmaking, I think the key thing, I attended a masterclass when I'd still only made one film. I attended a masterclass with a director here, and he said, what he suggests is you work out your story as well and as tightly as possible before you start. And then as soon as you start, you rip up your script and just follow the story. And that's what I did. And that took me, and the question with any film is what's the angle? And the problem with what we do as filmmakers is there's no science to it, right? It's completely subjective. So I started to make this film about the Jewish stars of India, and I would go and pitch it because it takes a lot of money to make a film. And the broadcasters would tell me, oh, it's a bit too Jewish. Can you make it a bit more Indian? Right? So I tweaked my reel, I tweaked my treatment, and then I would take it to the next industry market to pitch. And they'd say, it's a bit too Indian. Can it be a bit more Jewish? Right? And I was still in my naive days of thinking that broadcasters, not always being helpful. Sometimes they want a film to be everything, and they're looking for ways to say no. Anyway, I refined it, and then it was like, it's a bit too historical. Can you make it a bit more contemporary? And then I changed it again. I was young, rosy-eyed, green-eyed, enthusiastic filmmaker. And then I changed it again. It was like, it's a bit contemporary. Can you make it a bit more historical? At which point I thought, sod this, right? I'm just going to tell the story as I want to tell it, right? And did a little bit of crowdfunding, got a bit of philanthropic support, and then that 13 years later, I was making another film, and I was out with the filmmakers I was working with in Sydney, an editor and an animator, and we're talking about it, and the editor turns to me and goes, and we were friends, and he goes, 12 years, that's just ridiculous. You're going to finish that film and I'm going to help you do it. And then the animator goes, well, listen, I'm Indian, right? I'd love to make something to do with Bollywood. You're Jewish, let's do it together, because there's a lot of animation in the film. And so I went after 12 years on the final furlong. It took me 13 years to make it. And then, it had a very big festival life. Premiered at the Mumbai International Film Festival. It was selected and won an award at the Goa, Government of India Goa International Film Festival. Hasn't really had a TV life. Can't really explain why. But yeah, and it was, you talk about deferring the heavy stuff till after, what I love about Shalom Bollywood, and there's another quirky story I want to make, haven't been able to get any broadcast interest in it, is like these Jewish stories can be fun. They can be rollicking, good, fun. And Shalom Bollywood is a fun story. Yeah. I should say, it's quite just for the record, the story of Shalom Bollywood is different to the story of Jews in Hollywood. In Bollywood, it was basically a story of the Jewish women, not the Jewish men. They were Indians, not migrants, and they were on screen, not behind the camera. And the reason why it was Jewish women and why they were on screen is all part of the story.
It was absolutely fascinating, and I had no idea about any of this. That's one of the things that caught my eye when I first saw the title, even. But it was just such a fascinating story, and I had no idea that there was even like a community of Jews in India. Which is silly on my part, because it should be anywhere. But it was just an absolute fascinating movie, and I felt the same way when I saw Outback Rabbis. Was just such a fun thing to me also. But this is what I was talking about. The serious ones, you have these like fun, amusing movies, and then we get into a lot more serious ones too. And you mentioned one of them that I did want to ask about. My Mother's Lost Children, an incredible story. It reminded me of the Netflix film that was on recently, the No One Saw Us Leave. So in this film, you mentioned you had half siblings that you had no idea about, and then you did a podcast about them as well. So how long did it take for you to find out, to start tracking everyone down? I mean, how did you first find out about it?
Well, I should say a couple of things. First, just about Outback Rabbis and Shalom Bollywood. I think we bring our own kind of cultural prism to the films we make. And I'm English and grew up in a land rich in humor and comedy and satire and classic shows like Not the 9 o'clock News and The Young Ones. Americans don't have that kind of sarcastic sense of humor,
Which is why I love I love British films, British comedy films. Love. Yes.
so I think my films, even though I've lived out the UK now for longer than I lived there, I mean, I left there after I graduated university when I was in my young 20s. My filmic sensibility is English, right? Whether it's a serious film as My Mother's Lost Children, which in itself has many offbeat, quirky moments, and as well as films that are very kind of spoofy, like Shalom Bollywood and Outback Rabbis. The story for My Mother's Lost Children it was a story I'd always, it's told in the documentary and the podcast, I'd always known from the youngest possible age. My mother over Shalom always said she didn't want to keep any secrets from us, so that my full sister I grew up with in London and she always told us what happened to her when she was a young single mum. The father took their 2 children one day and never saw them again.
So you always knew?
Always knew. If you ask me, when did you find out? I don't remember the moment. My older sister in London, she's 3 years older than me, she remembers being sat down and told. I just can't remember the moment. I just know was always part of my memory, experience, knowledge. And without spoiling the story for potential viewers, about 40 years after they were taken, when I was a grown man and a father myself, my long lost siblings reappeared.
No.
And the story we had been told and led to believe was one that was not necessarily the case. And I think the film is a story about sometimes there are no absolute truths and people have their own truths. And it's a cross-cultural story because my mother's first husband was an Iranian Jewish man. My half siblings are Iranian Jews. Anyway, again, without spoiling it, we got reconnected as a family, and I was talking to my half sister, my long lost half sister, Michelle, and said, she was saying to me, if people knew what happened to her, that she looked for 40 years for her mum and then found her, it might give them hope. And I said, well, there is a way we can tell that story. I can try and make it as a film, right? And whenever I told people my story, because I was reconnected with my long lost half siblings for a decade or so before I made the film, whenever I would tell friends or anyone I'd meet, they'd go, that's an amazing story. You got to make it into a film. And I said, I'm not telling my family's story as a film, right? But the initiative for it came from my long lost half sister. And I said, I'll make this film, but only if everyone who's involved, everyone,
agreed.
And there was a big cast of characters, agreed. And I thought there was zero chance of that happening. I didn't think my long lost half brother, I didn't think their father, my mum's first husband, would agree. I didn't think my immediate family in the UK would agree. I didn't think another side of the family in Israel would agree. And lo and behold, everyone agreed. And I think that's because there's something about films and there's something about documentary films that is almost kind of cathartic. Yeah. And there's something neutral or safe about when you speak to a camera, as opposed to speaking to a person. And everyone agreed and everyone shared their story. And that is the film My Mother's Lost Children, which I made for the ABC and the BBC and for Yes in Israel.
Fascinating story. So, did they know about as well? Did they know that there was their mom out there? Nothing. They didn't know anything. Wow.
Nothing. They had been told a series of, how can I put it, non-truths.
Right.
Yeah, it's a long, complex story. So I can't really go into it here.
No, I want to see this documentary now. It's just fascinating.
Yeah.
So I want to ask about a couple of others there too. Okay, so first let me ask you about your film, Revenge, Our Dad the Nazi Killer. What's the basic story? How did that come to your attention? Because that one's also just incredible.
Okay, so I mentioned before, I don't find films find me. So, in Australia over summer, which it is now, because obviously I'm in the Southern Hemisphere, the country kind of closes down over Christmas, not just Christmas, New Year, from several days before Christmas into January, late January, certainly mid-January. And we have a culture here of holiday homes. That one thing Australia has a lot of is beaches. And I was down at our beach house about an hour outside of Melbourne. Think Mount Martha, but without the wealth and elites. And had friends down, and they'd been invited to a barbecue somewhere nearby at someone else's beach house down on the Mornington Peninsula. And they said, "Do you want to come?" And I was like, "No, I'm really happy reading my book." And one reason why I kind of, how can I put this, sometimes choose not to go to social events is because when people say you're a filmmaker, you have the same conversation. They go, "What have you made?" And, "Oh, I've got an idea for a film for you." And you have to explain why their idea for a film is not actually really going to work as a film, and how the film industry works, and how long it takes to make a film, and how expensive it is, and the distribution process. And I was very content just reading. But in a concession to my wife, I agreed to go to the barbecue. Needless to say, I get to the barbecue, we're sitting outside. "What do you do?" No, right? So I just had a film out called Strictly Jewish, about the Anti-Israel community, who more recently and more tragically, their synagogue was firebombed in Melbourne in late 24. You may have heard of, in this era of anti-Semitism in Australia. So what have you made? I made this film, blah, blah, blah. And someone pipes up, "Hey, my car was in your film," right? And there was a shot, it's a B-roll shot of the high street, and this car just kind of going through shot. Turns out it's the host of the barbecue. Anyway, had my veggie sausage, managed to get out of there relatively unscathed. Couple of days later, I get a call from the host of this barbecue saying, "We met at the barbecue, my car was in your film." And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, "So I've got this story." And I'm thinking, oh, here we go, right? And I'm already on autopilot to politely explain why it's not so viable. And he goes, "So my dad was a watchmaker, and in the Second World War, he led this very rare Jewish partisan group called Nakoma, which means revenge, in Belarusia." And I already say historical stories beyond, big budgets, Holocaust stories generally kind of feel they've sort of been done in a documentary space. And he goes, no. So he goes, "That's not what it's about. It's about, he died recently, and I was with my older brother and two older brothers. They're much older, 10, 20 years older. And my older sibling, who was an older cousin, who was about 30 years older. And they just started talking about this time Dad went to Sydney to knock off a Nazi in a revenge killing." And I'm like, "What?" And needless to say, my ears picked up. And I'm talking to him. So here's the irony of the situation. I go, "You know what? that sounds like it could be a great film. And he goes, no, I'm not calling you to make it into a film. I've got no interest in making it into a film. I just know that you do research and you're a filmmaker. You know how to find stories. I want to find out if it's true. I'm a busy doctor. I don't have time. Can I employ you to do the research for me to make this film? And I said, listen, I'm not a researcher for hire, but if I could get this film commissioned as a documentary, we could do the research as part of making a film. And that ended up being the documentary, Revenge, Our Dad, the Nazi Killer, which hasn't sold into America yet. Again, it was a BBC, ABC co-production with Denmark and Sweden's public broadcasters. I wanted to make it as a podcast as well, but I couldn't get any interest in that. And it's the subject of my first novel, which is coming out with HarperCollins very soon, called The Watchmaker's War. And as a documentary filmmaker, I actually got approached by HarperCollins, who heard about the film, and they said, would you like to write a book about this? And I was like, yeah, I'd love to. And it was a non-fiction book that I wanted to write. And I'm a non-fiction guy. I make documentaries. I used to be an academic. I've published a lot in academic sphere. And they went, no, fiction. And I'm going, but I don't write fiction. I don't make fiction. And they go, well, try, because we think it would be better as a novel. And I sat there with a proverbial blank page. And I'm going, this is ridiculous, right? I want to tell the true story. But after a couple of days, I started to write and started to amalgamate and imagine scenes and characters and plot lines. And according to HarperCollins, I am capable of writing fiction. So that's the latest creative venture for me.
When's that book coming out?
It's coming out in Australia and New Zealand on the 27th of January. I don't believe there's a rest of the world schedule yet.
I look forward to that. Well, I want to ask about you have two based on October 7th, and the VR films also look incredible. I was watching the trailers, and I'm dying to see these. So let me talk about Survive to Tell first of all. So you have people who actually went through it, and through the VR, the viewer feels like they're there. That's what I saw from the trailer, at least. So a couple of things. How difficult of a process is that to do in VR? And, well, how emotional was it for them and for you also, just, going through that and doing this process of, like, putting you there at the time?
Yeah. I think with VR, sometimes I've seen VR virtual reality films that kind of are a bit of a gimmick, that you're in this, you put on a headset and you're in this immersive space, and you think, why? And you think this could be a perfectly good 2D film, and I don't really get the chidush, I don't really get the point of why it's in 360. The idea for well, firstly, I made a VR film about the Melbourne, just to can give you a bit of the backstory on the VR, if I may. I was making a regular documentary about the last survivors at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, which Australia has the highest per capita number of Holocaust survivors anywhere in the world outside of Israel. Almost every Jew in Melbourne, and indeed in Australia, is a descendant of Holocaust survivors.
Oh, wow.
It's very unique community. And this museum, which was established by survivors, has 30,000 kids, school kids, come each year, and they met a survivor. Well, that was finite, right? Well, you could see, it was only a matter of time. So I was making a documentary about how the museum was grappling with the fact that they were not going to be having any survivors. They had all these programs and ideas. And then I was at Hot Docs, the big documentary conference in Toronto, and they had a big VR theme and lots of VR films showing. And I thought, this is how we do it. So we went and we filmed a survivor going back to Europe, their hometown in Poland, going to Auschwitz, going to Buchenwald, arriving in the port in Melbourne, their life in Australia. So it was life before, during and after the war. And we filmed with several other survivors as well. So kids who visit the museum and general visitors visit the museum can now put on a headset and meet a survivor and go on their journey. So we did that. And then when the democracy protests started in Israel in early 2023, after the Netanyahu government was re-elected, and there were these weekly protests that were the equivalent every Saturday night, that were the equivalent of millions of people turning out in America week after week after week. And I realized something existential was going on there. Now, one of my quirks, and in a way it might be told in the films I make, like Carnaby Street Undressed, I've always had this sort of slight kind of fascination of like, where would I go if I could time travel, right? And one of the places I would go would be to the Western Wall, the Kotel after the 6-Day War, or Sderot Rothschild, and being outside when Ben Gurion comes out with after his Declaration of Independence. All my time travel fantasies are not necessarily Jewish or Israel, but some of them are. And then I thought, with what was going on in Israel, this was a historic moment. Whichever way it pans out, when the history of Israel is written, this is a major chapter of it. And I felt I was missing it because I live so far away, emphasis on so far away, at the end of the world in Australia, that if I could capture it in 360, people around the world, and without being grandiose, future generations could see what it was like. You're not just watching a film about protesters on the street. You're there and you're looking, and they're to your right and to your left and in front of you, and you're standing on that street. And I was basically I made a film about, and that led me to spend much of 2023 prior to October 7 in Israel making that VR documentary. That VR film, then October 7 happened. And the legislation had passed, the judicial reforms, coup, depending on your perspective, legislation passed. And I thought, well, I finished my film, right? It was late August. I was in Israel, came back to Australia, and then October 7 happened. And all the NGOs and groups that had been disparaged by the government as part of that contentious legislation pivoted, and were kind of, one, literally running to the front to fight, and two, running the country, basically, when the government went AWOL. And so I realized there was this pivot, follow the story, as I mentioned before. So I got back to Israel very soon after October 7, and I captured the country I made this film called Shloshim, Israel the first 30 days after October 7, where we're in ghost towns that have been evacuated, like Sderot. We're in cemeteries where people are being buried. We're in civilian, they're called hamals, like HQ centers where people are organizing things. We're with the evacuees in their hotels. It's this kind of snapshot of Israel, but it's not, you don't look at it. You're there at the funeral. You're there in the ghost town. You're there in the hotel lobby, etc., etc. And if any of your listeners exhibit in VR, I'd love to find an outlet for that in other. It featured in the October 7 exhibition in Melbourne, and at the Jewish International Film Festival in Melbourne as well. And then I was back in Israel in 24, following that story. It's turned into this much bigger film with the protests now about the hostages, right, and what was going on in Hostage Square. And I plan to make a VR film just about Hostage Square, from the days immediately after October 7 to despair, highs, lows in 24, and then the day when hostages came home in 25. And so I was back in Israel filming and editing, and I got contacted by an NGO called Israel Is, who were making, and Stephen Smith, the former director of the Shoah Foundation, and they'd been making films in VR, or were trying to make films in VR with October 7 survivors. And they'd heard about my films, and we ended up kind of collaborating, and I was brought in to direct their films. So that's a long spiel to explain, but they had done the casting. And I think the idea was brilliant because it was people who were all heavily, heavily traumatized.
Sure.
I mean, that trauma was manifest off screen when we were in the locations, but they were determined to tell the story, what happened to them, what happened to their friends, what happened to their families. And while it might have been difficult for me to go to the locations or to trawl through some of the archive, it was like, if they've lived through what they've lived through and are prepared to tell the tale, the least I can do is try and do justice to their story. And like we were talking off camera before we started recording, it kind of gave me a way to sort of channel my despair energy in the post-October 7 days. So when it's not someone, you're not just seeing the Nova site or seeing the ditch where someone hid, where their friend was shot next to them, or the field they ran across to survive, or the house where they were taken hostage from. You're there with them. You're in the field. You're in the house. You're in the ditch. And those films, the Survive to Tell 5 films by the NGO Israel have been exhibited thousands and thousands of times, been on campuses, parliaments, all around the world. I'm continuing to film my essentially VR story of Israel. It's called Bibi versus the People of Israel. And it's a story about civil society in Israel in the Bibi years. So it's the judicial reform protests, then it's October 7, then it is, but October 7 is just a way till we see the resumption of the protests, and then it's going to culminate with the election, whichever way it goes. Mm-hmm. So it's just a VR snapshot of Israel in these three, I mean, life always seems to be dramatic in Israel, but at this time, and as I said, I've made the Shloshim film, which is a standalone VR film about Israel first 30 days after October 7, and I'm hoping to make a standalone film just about Hostage Square over the 2 and a bit years.
Well, I do want to ask about, you talking about anti-Semitism in Australia. That was what I did want to ask you about right now. And you and I spoke beforehand a little bit, and I connected with you on LinkedIn because I saw someone commented on one of your posts about Bondi Beach, so which I'll discuss in a moment. But I like I said, I didn't realize at first that you were someone that I had already seen your work, and you had just mentioned that you just finished a documentary on anti-Semitism in Australia, and that was prior to Bondi Beach. And I have to say, Australia is one of the places that I've always wanted to visit my entire life. It's a dream of mine to go there. But over the past couple of years, when I see footage on social media, things look horrific. So I know social media can distort, but so I want to ask you, in your opinion, how are things for Jews in Australia right now?
Terrible.
No.
People are shocked, when about this anti-Semitism in Australia, when I think because there's this notion of Australia, it's this friendly, lucky, happy country, the skies are always blue, the people say, "G'day, how you going, mate?" And, it's this multicultural society. And then it's like I had a senior television executive say to me today, "Oh, it's not going to get really bad in Australia." And I said, why is Australia different? What is it about Australia that means that the worst could not happen here? And by the worst, I don't mean we're all going to end up in chimneys, but Jewish life in Australia has been kind of transformed detrimentally since October 7, and it hasn't really improved. In fact, I would say it's actually got worse since the Bondi massacre. And, day-to-day life is deeply affected. There's this narrative that's taken root there's this anti-Zionist, which we know is anti-Semitic zeitgeist that has taken hold amongst our elites who shape the cultural contours of our country. There's been platitudes by the government for 2 years. There is a tolerance of intolerance. There is a failure to act appropriately by third-party organisations, be they businesses, universities, the police, local government, whatever it is. I realise the danger to us as a community is as much from the failure of third parties to respond appropriately as it is to the propagators of hate itself. And I think there's been this, there's been a lot. My documentary is actually about anti-Semitism in the arts sector post October 7, where cancel culture, doxing, the exclusion of Jews. And as a result of this, we as a community have been self-ghettoizing. The only place we can be safe is amongst our own. So Jews will continue to live here and will continue to create art here, but it's not going to be big public arts in mainstream galleries and exhibitions. It's going to be in a Jewish museum. And so we're very much unfree and excluded at the moment. And I'd finished making my documentary about I finished shooting it, not posting it.
Did you go back and add Bondi after?
And then Bondi happened.
Right.
It was like, and so it was a new tragic ending for my film. So I was in Bondi a week after the event, filming the memorial and some of my cast there and the flowers. And I'm now also making. I've been capturing in VR. I captured the Shloshim Memorial in VR. For that as well. So yeah, but here's the irony. I pitched this documentary to public broadcasters in Australia over the last kind of couple of years, and no one was interested, right? And I realised how we're being excluded from the cultural and obliterated from the cultural spaces. I pitched a podcast on anti-Semitism in Australia to SBS, who are our multicultural broadcaster. I mean, I guess they're kind of PBS equivalent, and didn't even get shortlisted. And I wanted to write a book about anti-Semitism. I won't go into details about that, but my agent said the problem is trying to pitch anything about, you're not going to have any success because the people you're pitching it to are the ones out on the streets saying globalize the Intifada. So we're kind of caught in this kind of trap, this cultural trap, and I have very limited cause for optimism.
Well,
all I can do as a filmmaker, all the films I make, Shalom Bollywood was my second film I made or started to make. It ended up being made years later. I kind of made on spec. I got out there, got a little bit of money and started making it. All the films I make are commissioned films because one, it means I get paid, right? So I can live on more than, and my family can live on more than bread and water. And two, importantly, means the film is distributed. It reaches a wide audience. Because you could say to me, hey, Danny, the Lens will give you $1 million, tell the story about anti-Semitism in Australia. I'll give you my bank details, but how do we get that film to an audience, right? But with this story of anti-Semitism in the arts sector, it was a year after October 7 when the Adus synagogue was firebombed in Melbourne. And I read about this Jewish artist, Nina, who was cancelled. And I realised, because it's like, we talk about anti-Semitism in Australia as filmmakers, how do we tell the story? I mean, that's, anti-Semitism in Australia. Who and how do we tell the story? And basically, I realised while I couldn't get any broadcaster interested in the film, ironically, I knew it was something that just had to be captured because the story was real. It was live. We stepped into the Adus synagogue, firebombed synagogue, to film my protagonist in there before the building was knocked down, right? Then this new gallery was opened, the Goldstone Gallery, to create a safe space to platform cancelled Jewish artists. The gallery was literally, you know, they were hanging signs up and it was like, this has got to be filmed. And basically, through the philanthropic process, was able to get enough money to shoot the film, just because I knew this has to be documented no matter what. And now I'm in the process, I'm in this holding pattern of, you know, will I find funding to post-produce it and distribute it? We'll see.
Well, Danny, I mean, this is all hitting home because I think it's very much the same way publishing industry. Like I mentioned to you, like I'm an author. I'm also a former literary agent. I see a lot of anti-Semitism in publishing. Well, in particular, ironically, in Kidlit, the children's book section, but that industry. But the children's writing world has just been awful, and I've also seen you call out that same industry recently. I saw you talking about authors that were canceled in the creative fields. So you anticipated my next question. I was wanting to know if that was the same way in filmmaking, and I guess it is really.
Yeah, I think with filmmaking, I'll give you two examples from my recent experience. One is not commissioning my films. Now, they could say, Danny, you're a bad filmmaker, or Danny, we want someone else to make this film. We don't like the way you're telling the story, all of that, right? I pitched a documentary with a, quite prominent Jewish actor in the UK to the BBC. And they said, oh, we're going to do it. We're already doing something on anti-Semitism. I have not, and this is a long time ago now, right. And I have not seen it. And I thought at the time, okay, good, right? I think they just, I believe they told us a half truth there because I'm not aware of anything being made. So I've got no problem someone saying, Danny, you're not the right filmmaker for this. Your approach is not the right approach for this. But I also have to ask myself, for public broadcasters, which we have a tradition of here, like the ABC and SBS, like the BBC in the UK, which is different to America, where your networks are not publicly government financed, of like, what bit of sand is your head in that you're not seeing that there's a story to be made here about anti-Semitism, right? And why are you not seeing it? Do you not believe it, or you're not empathetic to it? I don't know. I can't speak for others, but I want to share two examples of my lived experience. One was when I pitched the film, I was told, oh yeah, that could work, and you can include Islamophobia. And there's this default position that whenever you talk about, I'm not
100%. 100%.
I'm not advocating for 1 second for Islamophobia, right? I've researched racism, right? But why, if someone came along and said, make a film about Islamophobia, would you say anti-Semitism? You don't. And they're two very, very different forms of hate in quality, in quantity, in history, in consequences, all of that, right? So that's issue one. Issue two is I got an email. Firstly, it was also the silence, right? It's the silence is deafening. I told you I made a documentary years ago about the Anti Israel community. Right. I spent a year in that community, Strictly Jewish, the film was called. And then there was the firebombing. Now, apart from the fact I got no calls from anyone I'd worked with after October 7, right? No one just to say, hey, how are you? What's going on? Right? So that deafening silence. After a year later, and the Adass synagogue bombing, I spent a year in that community with various camera operators, sound operators, editors, production assistants, whatever goes into making a film. No one reached out to say, one, how are you? We'd spent a year in that building that has just been burnt down. Or, how are the people who we spent a year filming? Now, maybe it's just because people are busy, they just don't think about it, but it struck me as a bit odd and a bit wrong, to be honest. And it added to that sense of abandonment that you would expect any community to get some support rather than silence. Anyway, then Bondi happened. And I've got to say, I've felt a lot of love, right, since Bondi. Literally, I walked into the post house for something and someone came up and just gave me a hug, and got calls and messages and emails. So there's definitely a shift post Bondi. But I got one email after Bondi, said sending love. And it was from a filmmaker in another part of Australia, non-Jewish person, said, Danny, what's happened in Bondi is terrible, and stand with the Jewish community. And I think very nice. You know, how such a person, deranged person, could go on a killing spree is inexcusable. I think I'm feeling the love here, right? And how the Australian police and ASIO could fail in intelligence of the Jewish community is terrible. And I'm thinking, thank you for saying that. And then it goes on, and to think this is all Netanyahu's fault.
Yeah.
And this is someone sending what they think is a nice, consoling message.
Right.
And like, how do you even respond to that? There was a major film organisation in Australia, and I wrote to them after October 7, and I said, bear in mind, it's not like America, thank God, here. Shootings are a very, very rare beast. You know, I mean, I don't even bother reading the news when it comes to shooting in America because, you know, every day there's one, right? Here, it's like, I mean, an exceptional, you know, incident. Thank God, right? Australia is generally a physically safe space. And I contacted this film organisation, major film organisation, and saying, are you going to be putting out a statement saying you condemn the Islamic anti-Semitic terror attack and you stand with Jewish filmmakers at this time, right? And I get no reply. I send it again. I get a response from the director of this major film organisation to say, we're taking this as an opportunity to reflect and to consult internally with stakeholders. So I just responded, in other words, no. Right? No. Right? And who do you need to consult with? Maybe start with Jewish filmmakers. That might be a good start. And there has been one of the characters in my film, the graduation of her arts college. There's a speech after Bondi without mentioning the word Jew, which is quite an interesting linguistic somersault. So I think, you know, I know Jewish creators who have worked in arts organisations, film organisations in this country, including our national broadcaster, including Screen Australia, including Create New South Wales, who have been very uncomfortable in their workplaces, have left their workplaces as a result, and have, when they were in the employ of these arts major taxpayer-funded arts organisations, have suggested cultural competence training like you would about black people or minorities, whatever it might be. And the thing is, we are told, oh, there's not really a problem of anti-Semitism. Right. Now, why is it every minority gets to be believed about their lived experience, but not us, right? And I can only conclude because of discrimination. It's a discriminatory attitude. So the arts sector remains bad. You know, after October 7, sorry, Freudian slip, after December 14, the Bondi massacre, there's been a wave of public calls, which has been very consoling by business organisations, universities, legal organisations, all sporting organisations and leaders of all these groups calling for a royal commission, which I guess is like a Senate inquiry or whatever the equivalent is in America, but a government inquiry into what happened. One sector in society has not said a word, and they're very noisy because they've been shouting out about genocide and baby killing and you name it for the last 2 years, have not said a word, and that's the arts sector. So something very acute is going on here, and what worries me so much is while they may not be the majority numerically, and I think Middle Australia is not anti-Semitic, and Middle Australia is very sympathetic to the Jewish community after Bondi. Middle Australia does not want rowdy protests on their streets every 5 minutes. those cultural elites do. And they're shaping the contours and the direction of our country, which is compounded by a government that's been completely pathetic and inexcusable and AWOL on anti-Semitism, in my opinion. So,
Well, I share your opinion. But yes.
The skies may still be blue, but it feels like we're shrouded in a greyness.
Well, you just said something which is 100% true, because I've posted about this before. I've put it on my social media. Any minority could post, this one is racist, this one is anti-Asian. No one will question it. I've posted before about this one is a Jew hater, and I get tons of responses telling me why I'm wrong. And that's the only one that's okay to question. If you're Jewish, it's okay to question them and tell them why not,
But at least that confirms it for us, right?
Yes.
Like it's confirmation, like for whatever good that's worth. At least that.
Well, I've taken up so much of your time, but I also know when was the documentary on anti-Semitism in Australia going to be out? When was that planned?
Well, my idea is it would be available for release on October 7 at third year anniversary, or perhaps December 14 Bondi anniversary. Right now, I haven't got a penny of post-production funding or any broadcast interest. And interestingly, I discussed with my sales agent taking it to the international marketplace for funding. Oh. And interestingly, they said, this looks like a good film, but no one's going to want to support it at the present time because of the very reason the story tells. So I feel like I'm in a bit of this Kafkaesque novel, right? That's what's going on here. And I like reading Kafka, but I don't like living Kafka. What can I tell you?
It's one of the things that, if you don't laugh, you're going to be enraged, and it's just the absurdity of it really is. And I feel enraged now about hearing that you say that. But all right, so and what are you working on next? What do you have coming up next?
There may be another documentary about Bondi. There's VR films about Bondi, and I want to get back to Israel to complete this film of the sort of 3 years of Israel under Bibi, in terms of the public and the protest movement and civil society. So yeah, hopefully at least some of that may happen.
I got to say, I mentioned to you that I used to live in Israel as a kid. I went a few years ago for the first time since then, and I just love being there. It's just such a different feeling. It's for me when I was there. And most important question that people make sure I ask: how can people follow you on social media?
So they can primarily Facebook is I've got grey hair, so I'm allowed to be like old fashioned. So Facebook, LinkedIn. I do have Instagram, which I use much less, but they're the main ways.
Well, Danny, I want to thank you for coming on and taking the time to speak with me today. Like I said, I was a fan, and I have 1,000 questions, and I didn't want to take up so many times because so many of your documentaries are just incredible looking. So anytime you'd like to come back, I'd love to have you. But maybe when
please God will speak again. A lot of my films are some are on Amazon or available through my website, through Vimeo, pay on demand. And if anyone's got any specific questions, they can always send me a Facebook or LinkedIn message.
Well, that's where I saw Shalom Bollywood is on Amazon, by the way. So if anyone does, I highly recommend. But let me sign us off here. Again, this has been The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen. Again, a very special thanks to Danny Ben Moshe. And please like, comment, and subscribe.
Thanks for tuning in to The Jewish Lens, where all items used was strictly kosher.